Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. The Institute for Middle East Studies. I'm Mona Ataya. I'm the director of the Institute. We are delighted to be joined by Dr. Hatim El-Hibri and Dr. Will Youmans. Before I introduce the two of them, I want to thank Christian Clinton for all his work to make these events possible, and Elad Raymond for his help with publicity. Today, we have Hatim El-Hibri, who's assistant professor of film and media studies at George Mason University. His research and teaching interests focus on global and transnational media studies, visual cultural studies, Lebanon, the Middle East, urban studies, television studies, and media theory and history. His first book, and the topic of today's discussion, Visions of Beirut, The Urban Life of Media Infrastructure, was published by Duke University Press. And his second book, now in its early stages, will uncover the genealogy of the Arab street and the media's historical conditions and urban contestations that have defined it in the 20th and 21st centuries. That project is informed by two secondary lines of research: the place of televisuality and affect in contemporary politics and its racializations, and the history of regionality in media industries. In the fall of 2019, he was a visiting faculty fellow at the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communications at the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania. And prior to joining George Mason, he was at the American University in Beirut. Thank you so much, Hatim, for joining us today. He is going to be in conversation with his interlocutor, Will Youmans, who is our very own GW Associate Professor of Media, Public Affairs, and International Affairs, as well as the director of the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communications in the Elliott School. His broad interests are questions of transnationalism, power, and communication, and he works on global news, law, and politics, as well as research on terrorism, American international broadcasting, Middle East politics, and Arab American studies. He is author of Unlikely Audience, Al Jazeera's Struggle in America, published by Oxford University Press, and has been regularly quoted in the media, among others. He's also working on a film project. So he is a man of many talents as well. Will, thank you so much for joining us today. So I will pass the microphone to you to introduce us to our conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mona. I definitely need a shorter bio. Sorry about that, Hatim and everybody. But thank you, everybody, for joining this event. I've been looking forward to it for a long time. I've read the book when it first came out, and I got reacquainted with it again, and it feels like an old friend. And so I'm happy to have you here for this conversation, Hatim. Now, not everyone who is in attendance has had the pleasure of being able to read the book, and maybe they just know the blurb. I would ask you to do the perhaps annoying thing of just sort of walking us through as an overview and going through like the cases in the chapters where the rubber really meets the road theoretically.
Sure. So I can give you, in brief, this book is about the tension between embodied mobility and visual circulation, thinking from the city of Beirut outwards. Now, how I came to this, there's a specific fieldwork experience which led me to this question. So I'll give you that, and then I'll show you how that initial sort of point of puzzlement led to the chapter structures and theoretical interventions that the book makes. So in December of 2006, I was going back to Beirut to visit family, the way many people do. And at the time, there was a sit-in demonstration organized by Hizbullah, the Lebanese political party. The party had just fought a war with Israel in the summer of that year. And the protest was to bring down an opposing political bloc, which they accused of being too closely aligned with the West. So I could go down to downtown Beirut, which is the most manicured part of the city, which was rebuilt after the Civil War between 1975 and 1990 by a private real estate firm aligned with the sometime prime minister of the country after the Civil War. So I go what's ordinary to this part of the city, which is normally sort of very tightly controlled and heavily policed, and it's a nighttime street fair, right? You have people smoking shisha in major thoroughfares. You had stalls selling kebab and popcorn and cotton candy and party memorabilia. Major roadways were closed off and turned into places for people to hang out. And I noticed that at key parts of the neighborhood, particularly if you know the city, near the southern end of Sehet al-Shahada and Riyadh al-Sarah Square, they'd set up these large projection screens. And when there wasn't a speaker or musical performer on the stage in front of the screen, what would be playing would be the satellite TV channel Al-Manar, affiliated with Hizbullah. And then I noticed that at key moments, what was playing on the screen was live Al-Manar coverage of the protest in the city at the protest. I was like, okay, there's something, curious about seeing that kind of visual circularity of the mise en abîme being created on site. Mise en abîme is when you have an image that contains an image of itself within its own frame. I said, but I thought to myself, but actually there's something else going on here. There must be a way to contextualize and make sense of the relationship of images to the city. This must be told as part of a history of how regimes of power have found images to be useful to shaping the spaces of the city, but also to contesting it. And that's sort of where this book came from, an attempt to reckon with not just that particular event, but the social and political fields and entanglements of visuality and infrastructure in particular, with attempts to shape the city and its people. So this is how I ended up with a chapter about the history of mapping, urban planning, and its related technologies such as aerial photography, dating from the French Mandate through damage assessment exercises during the Civil War. This then leads to a chapter which sort of pairs closely with it about post-war construction, which explores how images of what I call before-after, a shot of the city or streets or buildings before post-war construction and then after post-war construction, ruination, the perfect future, what role they played in 1990s financialization, and what particular role culture came to play for neoliberal urbanism. The latter two chapters shift from a close focus on how images shape the infrastructure of the city or were used to construct or reshape the city, and instead turns more closely to the materiality of media infrastructure itself. I have some more specific things to say about infrastructure, which maybe I'll leave for a second follow-up question, but this chapter, so the chapter 3 then focuses very closely on the Al-Manar satellite TV channel during the 2006 war in particular, by looking at the very contested and fraught place that it has, both in terrestrial and transnational broadcast spheres. I think we come to a distinct understanding of infrastructure as always already incomplete, something very fraught, whereas ordinarily we think of an infrastructure as being equal to sovereignty, which is one with itself. I instead try to think of multiple infrastructures in conflict with each other. And this is where, given my concern with visuality and visual culture, I end up with having to think about what I call practices of concealment. By concealment, I mean a media-oriented practice of trying to remain unseen and hidden. Whereas we normally think of images in war in terms of spectacle and surveillance, those spectacular events which draw people's attention or mind people's attention, or surveillance, those attempts to see so as to enable military targeting, to better enable military conflict. You also have practices of concealment, attempts to remain hidden and unseen deliberately. And concealment has a contradictory dialectical relationship with spectacle and surveillance, which that chapter tries to unpack. The last day of what I thought was going to be the last day of my fieldwork as a grad student, I was out with friends getting a drink, and a friend who's a journalist comes, bursting in. She's like in a rush, and she's like, "I need a drink. I need a drink." like, oh, what's going on? She's like, this was in end of May 2010. She says, I just came back from a press conference for the opening of Hezbollah's Milita Museum of the Resistance. I was like, hold the phone, what now? So a week later, I take the first of what would turn into about a dozen visits. The Milita Museum is important for this book because it takes us outside of the immediate municipality of Beirut, so as to try to destabilize a Beiruti-centric perspective on Beirut, and to think about what happens when concealment is turned into a museum display. That chapter is another way of bringing back some of the book's key themes of this tension between embodied mobility, visual circulation, infrastructure, and the politics of images.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to pick up on concealment because to me that was one of the big revelations in the book for me, is because we think of concealment as being fundamentally anti-communicative, but here's a way of putting out concealment as a way of facilitating possibilities of communication. You know, I told you before, or mentioned to you before, that one of my classes we were reading Heidegger, you know, looking at the essence of technology, and technology, he argued, was something that brings forth. It does the opposite of concealing. And so technology, the marvel of technology, or what makes technology is it's able to unveil what is actually concealed. And I'd before thought about concealment only in terms of like, in communicative terms, as being like cryptography is an example. So you really opened up some ways, I think, of thinking about how concealment facilitates communication. So there is also the work on infrastructure that, you know, part of why infrastructure works is because it is concealed, and it's the hiddenness of it that makes it what's sort of taken for granted, you know. And so internet cables, when they're hanging everywhere, they become sort of an eyesore, or we become very conscious of what the infrastructure is actually doing. So in some ways, concealment is essential in other ways, in hiding things from plain sight. So yeah, thank you for you know, even to me, I thought this was such a wonderful theoretical intervention. I know you wanted to say more on infrastructure. I don't know if it was regarding in relationship to concealment, but I'd be curious in hearing what you wanted to say about infrastructure.
Well, what I have to say about infrastructures in this book is wrapped up with what I say about concealment. Yeah, you know, what to do with the really compelling questions that Heidegger asks is a difficult answer. I don't know that I have a great answer, you know, should we touch Heidegger or not?
Yeah.
But one of the things that he really powerfully argues is the idea that technology, is an entire way of doing and being, right? It's not simply a purely instrumentalized understanding of technology obscures what technology actually does. I think of concealment, well, I try to push back against a few ways of thinking about concealment. The first is, you know, we often think of concealment is like the bad thing that, concealment is censorship, concealment is the government keeping secrets from a population, and the good thing is transparency. The good thing is when everything connects and we can all talk, and there's public discourse, and everything is brought into evidence, right? But there's a real politics to knowing when and where to stay hidden, knowing how to not allow yourself to be transparent to the state. And the thing is that concealment is not simply equatable with either oppression or with resistance. I try to go to great pains in this book to say, like, look, concealment can be like protesters running and hiding from the cops, but it can also be like plainclothes state militia disappearing people at borders, right? Or it can be the hiddenness of the state prison, where part of the torture that you undergo is knowing that nobody knows where you are, right? Concealment for me is wrapped up with the functioning of technology. One of the examples that I point to here in the book is how the Al-Manar satellite transponder stays on throughout the 2006 war, despite the main building the main Elemenor station being bombed repeatedly. The channel cuts for a little bit, maybe 2 minutes before, during a particularly heavy period of bombardment before switching to a concealed backup transponder. So like you're saying, infrastructure can be immediately hidden from things like IDF targeting. But this, to my mind, is somewhat different than how we normally talk about infrastructural concealment, which is that infrastructure functions smoothly in the background, and it's only at a moment of catastrophic failure, which is almost like an act of God, where suddenly the functioning of the infrastructure, which we had forgotten, which was ready to hand in like Heidegger's language, suddenly returns, and we become aware of how our systems of life are built around socio-technical systems. But the thing is, in many places in what gets called the global South, and certainly in a place like Lebanon and the period that I'm talking about, smooth infrastructural functioning is not the everyday or the normal. It's continuous interruption. It's constant ongoing brokenness is much more the normative part of the everyday. Rather, it's not, will a cut hypothetically happen at some point in the future because Governor Abbott and Texas Republicans have designed Texas's energy grid a very particular way. It's more about like, how regular are the cuts? We know that if the electricity comes on at 3, it's because it came from the state. Ishtid-dawli, right? That's how people will say it. Infrastructure for me is always already incomplete.
Yeah.
The broadcast is not guaranteed to arrive. Infrastructure is incomplete in the sense that it is always already in need of maintenance and repair, that it is never the same thing as the logic of the diagram or the blueprint. I think we need to think about infrastructure in its concrete material operation, which means attending to its contingencies rather than its essences, where we should not assume that what it does is automatically function according to the desires of the state. We need to see infrastructure not like a state, even if it does comprise states.
Yeah. It seems like with the Solidaire chapter, you know, the downtown Beirut and the papering over of the civil war, this sort of like historical dememorialization of the war, if you will. It seems like there's an act of concealment there too, even though you don't consider that one of your concealment chapters. But it's a way that actual physical infrastructure also puts into hiding, but it's a dysfunctional putting into hiding, not a productive concealment like you're talking about with the other examples.
Would concealment include things like solidaires, erasure of attempts to erase the traces of the Civil War? I would say no. Solidaire is a spectacular form. Solidaire is itself, while it might entail some forms of erasure, which of course it's never able to really affect as completely as it presents itself as doing, right? Anywhere within, and again, this is only Solidaire up to a certain point in history. Certainly by the time you get to 2019, it's a very different ambit, that part of the city. What the before-after image is about is it's a contrast between the state of the city as it existed after the end of the Civil War, the ruination done by militia combat and aerial bombardment, with an image of here's what it will look like after construction and restoration will be finished. Historically, first, that second part, the aftershot, was architectural renderings or artists' illustrations and visualizations. Later, it comes to be photography of the actual space. The before-after image is it would only be concealing in a very loose sense of the term. By concealment, I mean something much more immediate. I mean, concealment is Hizbullah's military infrastructure in the south of the country. It's underground bunkers, which surveillance imagery has not been able to uncover. Concealment is a visual modality of relatively uncommunicative relations. We have a hard time, and people in communication studies and media studies, we have a hard time grappling with it, I think, because we're really good at talking about the moment of connection. We're really good at talking about the moment of interrelationality. We have very sophisticated language for thinking about that. We're not as good at thinking in media and communication studies at thinking about things like refusal, of deliberate silence. We're not as good at thinking about those things.
Breakdown. Yeah. Well, see, I want to push back a little bit on Solidaire, because from what I understand, this was the dividing point between East and West Beirut. It was the killing zone. It was where the snipers would get anybody who tried to cross. And it was kind of a emblematic of a central point in the Civil War. So how can you not read that within the context of no resolution, no historical discussion, no proper memorialization of the Civil War? So within the sort of political culture around the Civil War, how do you not see Solidaire as a papering over of this festering wound in the national memory?
The funny thing is about papering over festering wounds is that the wounded know that the wound is there.
Yeah.
Oftentimes people will talk about Solidaire, and certainly this is a certain strand of the liberal imaginary in Lebanon, is like Solidaire is the forgetting of the war. If this erasure is the obscuring, or in a different reading is symptomatic of a national inability to deal with. Sometimes the language of trauma is adopted, right? Instead of dealing with the Civil War, instead we just do like the Solidaire get rich quick real estate scam version of post-war construction, where there's no comprehensive economic plan for the city beyond dollar stabilization. There's very little attempt to deal with the city systematically. There's sort of like a carved out series of islands of sovereignty. Solidaire is one of several post-war construction projects. The Elisar project in South Beirut, for example, is another. Elinor being the third major one. Solidaire is instead a relentless affirmation of a very particular future, right? Part of what Solidaire enables is a reworking of not just the banking sector around a new set of financial circuitries, but it also plugs a new set of political relations to the space itself. It does this through images, right? But the war is omnipresent. It is everywhere in post-war Lebanon. People can't stop remembering it. They can't stop talking about it. They can't stop anticipating future wars. Heba Bouhakkar's book, For the War Yet to Come, brilliantly playing off of Abdelmalik Simone's book, For the City Yet to Come, For the War Yet to Come, is about how anticipation of future conflict is deeply embedded in post-war urban planning at the level of municipal plans, zoning restrictions, real estate sales, patterns of real estate sales on a sectarian basis. So the potential for future war is everywhere. It's always anticipated. I've heard people describe Solidaire as not being post-apocalyptic, but being pre-apocalyptic. With, of course, that then makes that sense of war is inevitable, finds a kind of teleological culmination in the port blast of August 2020. People are like, oh, this was the other shoe that we always knew was going to drop. We just never thought it would be this bad, right?
I'd like you to say more about that, because in the end of the book, I believe in the epilogue, you make reference to the port explosion, and it's completely, infrastructural. And there was some part of that, some element of that is about the concealment of, the storage of the fertilizer. I don't remember the exact details of what brought about this explosion, but then the mediation, the hypermediation of that for people outside of the country. And of course, the implication for the futurism, Lebanese futurism, and the role of Hizbullah. It seems like it ties in so many things, but you had to finish the book, so you couldn't sort of wait. So now with a year, more than a year to reflect on it, how do you talk about that in the context of your arguments?
So yes, I was finalizing revisions on the book in fall of 2019. And mid-October rolls around and an uprising emerges with people speaking the language of revolution. And I was like, I need the world to stop or I'll never be able to finish this book. Please, I'm never gonna. And of course, I'm like immediately become displaced from being in North America while everything's happening over there. Like half my head is there at all times, and doubly so when like people will WhatsApp call me from like tires burning in front of Parliament, right? And so I managed to slip in a mention to the port blast because they gave me page proofs later in the year in 2020, and I was like, okay, just correct this sentence to insert this here without any ability to talk about it. It's difficult to, I guess, overstate the impact that the combination of the collapse of the financial sector, the devaluation of the currency, the shuttering of banks, COVID pandemic, which effectively ended those protests, the martial law lockdowns, which followed from COVID pandemic, and then the port blast, what they have done to Beirut. I talk in the book about flickering lights that come on and off. The last time I visited Beirut, which was in early November, 2021, I've never seen anything like the pitch black darkness in the center of the city, in Hamra, for example. It felt sepulchral, the total darkness, which of course is then punctuated by, islands of light here and there, right? It's the only place where I've seen total darkness like that is like way out in the countryside in the woods. And if you've ever been to a place that has like a true night sky, it's sort of like that. People definitely who lived during the war tell me that what they're seeing now is far worse than all 15 years of the war by far. They would say like during the war, it was bad, but like you could go to the bank and get your money. Maybe it took a while to place a call overseas, and maybe you couldn't get all of the goods from overseas that you wanted, but there were ways to get by. This is a different kind. There's a different kind of tear in the social fabric which has happened, which many people describe as feeling unprecedented. The blast at the port was because of 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate, which had been improperly stored there since 2014, with no one really dealing with them. There's a shady set of supply chain shell companies that are involved with how it ends up in Beirut to begin with. And they just left it there, and an accident leads to it exploding and devastating large swaths of the city, leaving hundreds of thousands of people, homes destroyed. Devastation, right? Now there's an emerging conversation about what should be done with the site of the port. How should it be built? Should the grain silos, which remain there, which shielded parts of the city from the blast, should they be torn down? Should they be turned into a memorial? And there's a similar set of conversations, I think, potentially emerging here around what should the shape of the city be? That reminds me of mid-90s Beirut, early 90s Beirut. Before Solidaire was a fait accompli, before the post-war consensus was built into the shape of the city, there were wide-ranging debates. What shape should post-war construction be? What kind of economic relationalities should post-war construction serve? There's a similar set of debates which are emerging now around, like, who should benefit from the port? How should the port's economy help the people who live nearby, for example? You have really brilliant people staging some of this commentary, pushing back on the inevitabilities of capital accumulation as the horizon through which to think sectarianism, capitalism, and politics more broadly.
I want to ask you about regionality, given that, Hatim was co-organized the last IMS conference, and we were focusing on regional trajectories around media. But the backdrop in this book is about Lebanon in the region for me, even though you're focused so much on the city. And of course, we have the colonial mapping which is part of, it was part parcel of France's regional designs with Syria. And there was obviously a special relationship with Lebanon. So maybe that's not the best example of the regionality, but really with Solidaire and the sort of Saudi influence with Hariri, and then of course Hizbullah's regional sort of ties, and then just being in the Levant next to Israel, which was a long time occupier. There's a story there about Lebanon's place in the region, and also a question of sort of Lebanese exceptionalism to your analysis, because of the complications of the formation of the state, or the not yet realized formation of the state, and the way that this particular histories play a role in these sort of infrastructure movements. So that's my two questions about regionality, and sort of about, is this like such a specifically Lebanese analysis that it would be difficult to apply to other places, or at least maybe it would work in other places where the incompleteness of infrastructure is more obvious because of state development and the influence of foreign powers. So those are two sort of related questions. I'm just throwing them at you, hoping you can make sense of them for me.
Man, it is so great to have an interlocutor and a discussant who's like so tuned into like what the book really wants to talk about. This is great. Thank you for this great question.
Yeah. Say more about how great I am, please.
So
just kidding.
Yeah, so first of all, I do try to attend quite closely to the specificities of Lebanon and Beirut, right? To examine the ground on which the book is digging, right? But I do think that, well, certainly a lot of the insights that I come to in this book are from work elsewhere in Middle East studies, but also from the study of infrastructure and television far beyond the region. And I try to make some of the conditions that I'm describing speak to many other situations as possible, as well as a range of theoretical traditions. Concealment, for example, can mean many different things in different theoretical and disciplinary conversations. Part of the story of a place like Beirut, like anywhere else, is that it's bound up with spatial relations that far exceed it, right? The minute you start looking at the history of urban planning in Beirut, you start to find that, oh, well, a bunch of these French officers were imported from North Africa. In there's a deep structural relation between French counterinsurgency doctrine, urban planning, and what happens in Syria, the French mandate over Syria and Lebanon, at the level of its practice and prosecution, right? How they understood partnering with local elites around traditional structures versus a modern economy, for example, is part of how you end up with sectarianism. But also you have like concrete personnel, people like Michel Ecochard, for example, who circulated between studying architectural history in Damascus to working in Morocco, to setting up an atelier in France and coming back to Lebanon as a locally trusted and respected expert. But one of the people who I interviewed, a man by the name of Grégoire Serov, who was in his late 80s when I talked to him, wanted me to know, was very keen to impress on me two things. He's like, Hatim, first, the French officials tried to turn Beirut into a North African city, is his words. And they failed at doing it. And we live with the consequences of that attempt. And I can go into detail about what exactly he's referring to there. He's like, but the other thing that he pointed out was like part of the construction of the cadastral mapping system, again, to sort of dwell on that maps chapter for a second, it's like part of the original survey work done for that involved a team of Russian survey engineers. Gregor Serov was himself Russian, but had lived in Beirut since the 50s, right? He's like, I'm Beiruti. He walks and talks and sounds like a Beiruti in his disposition, but he looks Russian, and his name is Gregor Serov. He's like, Hatim, this team it's not a coincidence that they were brought here. He's like, the guy who organized the cadastral survey, Camille Durafour, his wife was Russian. And the reason why they brought these guys over was they had just gotten done doing survey work in the newly formed state of Yugoslavia. It's like the idea was this is another newly formed nation state designed to contain the so-called implicit fragmentations of a plural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious plural society, right? So these guys are good at doing like survey work in relation to, honestly, a type of ethnology which supported eugenics in the formation of some Eastern European states, right? This is like US immigration policy starts to play a role in how the nation states are drawn in Europe. Like these people are of inferior genetic stock. So this is now one state and only so many of you can come from here. I'm not saying that's what happens in Lebanon, but there's this connection, this circulation. Certainly in much of the book, say from that, which goes from the 1990s going forward, I'm tracing the emergence of a transnational media sphere, which Lebanon plays an outsized role in, and is involved with interregional rivalry and political economy, which at one point was, like you're saying, about a fight against Israeli occupation, which itself becomes the grounds for an expansion of Hezbollah, which turns into, in a later point, a regional hot Cold War between the US, Saudi Arabia and its allies, and Iran and its allies, which plays out across Lebanese media and in the spaces of the city in very particular ways. So it is about a multipolarity. I was trying to be very attentive to a way to think about politics beyond what someone like Hassan Haj calls the tyranny of the geopolitical. What would it mean to imagine politics beyond the crushing weight of imperial blocs and global power interests, particularly in a place like Lebanon, which is so deeply enmeshed in them. Refracts them is one of the places where it plays out in very concrete ways, at the level of infrastructure even, right? Like part of the reason why Hezbollah are able to maintain a state of concealment of specific operational assets is they maintain a fiber optic network, which is structurally inaccessible from the global internet, for example, right? But again, concealment can have open secrets that you nonetheless are unable to be uncovered if you are not in on it. While at the same time, concealment can enable infrastructural functioning. The infrastructure has to remain hidden, otherwise it can become targeted. If it remains hidden, then perhaps it lends itself to other kinds of infrastructural conflict, like signal hacking and signal jamming, like part of what I discussed in the 2006 war.
Hey, what are sort of driving logics of concealment? Because on the one hand, obviously there's a resistance aspect to it, and that Hezbollah's formation takes place in the context of Israeli occupation, and so if you're a resistance, concealment is like an obvious way to go. I mean, it's the only way to really survive and accomplish anything. But are there other sort of motivating forces that you would identify other than resistance that are at play here?
I think of concealment not in terms of resistance, but in terms of politics of antagonism. Concealment is the opposite of recognition, right? Concealment is remaining deliberately hidden so as to not be targeted. The primary purpose of concealment is not to better communicate with one's adversary, but to remain undetected by it. Which is to say that like concealment is also something that like Israeli commandos are doing. And I'm very careful about to stress that although Hezbollah do describe themselves as the Islamic resistance, they are best understood as a fundamental part of a structure they bill themselves as being opposed to. There's a long history of Hezbollah's being made compatible with the sectarian political system, not just its economy, but its political system as well. And certainly by the time you get to something like the 2019 uprising, the big reason why the uprising fails to meet its objectives of collapsing the regime is basically like Hezbollah and Amal, another major political party, and armed militias say, look, you're talking about the downfall of the regime. You better be ready to back that up because we absolutely are willing to do like urban warfare here. And unless you're willing to meet us in arms, go back home. And this really breaks the revolution. People were not willing to do a civil war, which the language of revolution potentially provokes, right? So yeah, resistance I would say in a very limited sense of being opposed to Israeli occupation. Of course, Hezbollah are not the only group involved in fighting Israeli occupation, despite how they will often suck up all the air in that conversation. And if you're concerned with a radical left critique of something like the sectarian system, of actually existing neoliberalism, then you must have a critical edge against appropriations of the term resistance. And this is something very much that the book aims to demonstrate. I want to understand concealment and the before-after image because I want to be able to identify the conditions which we face, right? For example, if you were to simply nationalize Solidaire, but not undo its the fundamental ruination of the city that it presumes as part of its process of accumulation, then you would not really have done much, right? You would have maintained an internal logic of accumulation, which is fundamentally about dispossession, which is fundamentally about reworking relations to the city through visual relations, which are not something to be easily appropriated. At the same time, contending with and dealing with the fact of Hezbollah as the only credible military counterweight to Israeli aggression is also not something to be taken lightly. So I want to have a both and critique. I want to show throughout the book the contingencies that enable infrastructure to operate, but also how things could have been otherwise. Things could have very almost turned into something else. And so the book takes a historical frame to sort of show how that is. The take on concealment is sort of like a more pressing, immediate tactical relation, right? Concealment in the sense of we have to know when and where things are, when and where and how to hide, and when and where to deal with things that are hidden. That's sort of like my push to say, here's how the specificities of Lebanon might be quite specific, but they do, I hope, illuminate or speak to a broader set of concerns, of some of the theoretical nature, some of it more immediate relational nature of solidarity, for example.
Well, I could ask many more questions. I think there might be a question in the chat room, and then I'll go back if no one else has any more questions. But yeah,
the chat room that really shows your
what I call it?
Yeah, the chat room. Is this like the 90s? This is the back to the early 90s.
I'm teaching history of the internet in my class, so
okay.
that's it. I'm really young.
Okay,
yeah.
there you go.
You're asking shit.
We do have one question from Firat Oruk. He says, thanks for this fascinating conversation. Since throughout your talk you refer to Hizbullah and concealment, he says, I can't help but think of the Shiite notion of concealment of the hidden. Can you talk at all about this, about a certain sort of Shiite iconology, I think, in the formation of that media infrastructural vision?
So
A very philosophical question.
I mean, thanks for this question. It's important to clarify this. So although I'm not a scholar of religion or theology, I'm familiar with the concept of occlusion in Shia theologies, right? Concealment, I'd say, is a bit different from that notion of occlusion, the disappeared or the hidden imam, for example. I think that's much more about a relationship of knowledge to the divine and history. And I will say that there's a great deal about a religious affect and its reworking along with infrastructure that I spend some time with, especially in chapters 3 and 4 in the book. But here, rather than gesturing to the long religious tradition of Shiism, I'm thinking more about how that gets reworked in light of modern media technology and modern media systems. to be revealed or to be concealed happens on live TV. There are things that are God-like that are attributed to Hassan Nasrallah and the declaration of a divine victory after 2006. And there's a lot which could be said about how and where, for example, Nasrallah's speeches make very learned reference to Islamic tradition. But I wouldn't do like I'd be hesitant to do like a stronger culturalist read saying that Hizbullah do concealment because of a Shia tradition of occlusion or of taqiyya, of concealing one's religious beliefs so as to protect oneself. I would say like much more immediately, they do concealment because they study guerrilla warfare, right? Maybe there's a theology of guerrilla warfare which accompanies it, but that's that's a different terrain, right? Concealment is like an immediate live relationality.
I mean, it's a good question though, because your examples are so Hizbullah oriented, like the strongest concealment examples. So.
And there is a way that things that we might not think of as being religious really are, particularly in the relationship of faith that we bear with TV news, for example. Yeah. But at that point, it's not because it's Hizbullah that it's religious. It's more that Hizbullah is more like other things which are also religious than Hizbullah being particularly religious.
Thank you. We do have another question from Blake Atwood. He says, thanks so much for this wonderful discussion. One of the things I appreciate about your work is that it is very different than a lot of the scholarship on media in Lebanon in terms of methodology and how you conceive of media. I was wondering if you could comment a bit more on that and then situate your book in the literature, in the broader literature on the Lebanese media.
Yeah, I mean, there's my background in training is in a version of media studies and communication and visual communication studies and visual culture studies, which is, I'd say, less. It's less like more comm studies, more conventionally understood, and much more sort of riotously interdisciplinary. MCC at NYU was a good place to wander far and wide. But one of the things that I took from that was that whatever the question it is that one is asking or the object one is trying to study, one must fit your method and approach of inquiry to the question rather than fitting the question to like your methodological toolbox or the disciplinary confines, right? Just because something is new in media studies doesn't mean it's new in urban studies, for example. This is one of the big engagements that I like stage like for myself. I was like, if I'm going to make sense of this thing, I need to pay attention to what these super smart people in like critical cartography and critical urban studies are doing, right? Fascinating, rich theoretical conversations there that I draw from. There's great work on Lebanon, interdisciplinary work on Lebanon that I draw from. Anthropological work, people like Lada Deeb and Joanne Newhell. There's also a longer history of media studies of the Arab world, which gave me the basics of the political economy of the system that I'm trying to make sense of, right? I'm very indebted to that tradition in media and in communication studies. It allows me to then ask bigger, broader questions or to start to address my questions with a new footing. For example, like you're like pointing to, like a different study would have spent time with, for example, Al-Manar's audiences, would have conducted an audience study. How do people watch Al-Manar? What are their experiences? How do they feel about how they tune in, right? Fascinating, rich work could be done there. A different kind of approach would have also, and this is one that I originally thought I was going to do, which is I should be studying like news frames on Al-Manar's nightly broadcasts in 2006. I don't know why this is the example I'm focusing on, right? Which would be very rich, right? What was their language? How did they frame these things? What's the visual iconography? But then as I started trying to make sense of the 2006 war, I'm like, no, this is not the big story here. The big story here is that they're filming live from the front line with a hidden camera crew. And this camera crew is staying hidden while broadcasting from the front line. That is a relationship of media to space. That is the vector along which the news frame travels and moves, but not primarily about the news frame itself. Concealment is primarily non-aesthetic. It does not appear, even as it enables highly aestheticized, spectacular things, such as, for example, the Hizbullah strike on an Israeli naval vessel off the coast of Beirut, which they do live on camera, right? They switch to the camera moments before the rocket strike, do the rocket strike, and then just roll on it as it burns for like the next 6 hours or whatever. Which can feel very theological, right? This is to intervene in world history is to intervene in the televisual sphere.
Thank you. So we have 2 more questions, so I'll read them both, and then you can answer them more quickly since we only have a few minutes. The first one is from Mona. She says, I appreciate how much you engage with geographical concepts. In the first chapter, you argue that mapping offers us, quote, a critical sense of the micro practices of different regimes of power. Although I know this chapter was about the archive, I would love to hear your thoughts about counter cartographies in relation to mapping Beirut. And the second question is from Ari Dubnov. And his question is, I must read your book, and this certainly made me curious. Beyond Heidegger and concealment, I am thinking out loud here about Stanley Cohen's book, States of Denial. Is his sociological approach with a strong emphasis on nationalism studies still relevant, or is it lacking due to his lack of attention to mass media?
I'll try to answer both concisely. One of the things which falls away from this book is a more robust account of counter-cartography, the other purposes that mapping might be put to and its history in Lebanon. Because and this is sadly not part of what the book is about, or not able to cover, right? This is maybe not the weakness of the book, but one of the things which, if to really do it, I would have needed another 2 chapters, right? And so you have to pick and choose. And instead, I tried to attend to the frailties of the practices of power. And this was my attempt to contribute to this, right? Ordinarily, we think of the map is epistemic violence, is space being made legible and therefore controllable and manageable, that knowledge equals power over space. But the practices are much more contingent and half implemented, and urban plans remain unimplemented in a place like Lebanon. So I tried to show that. Part of how I do that is, like you're saying, by thinking very carefully about the relationship between the life of these maps, what it is that they do, and the space of the city itself as being bound up in a recursive process in which power tries to shape the space and generates maps in the process, but then the life of the city folds back onto that process of power, blocking it, stymieing it, rechanneling it, and undoing it. I'm not familiar with states of denial, but I would say that as a media studies scholar, speaking about nationalism without speaking about it as pure ideas or pure discourse, without paying attention to the institutional arrangements, without attending to the particular manner in which discourse circulates, how it is that people encounter it, the cultural forms that it takes, I would think that that'd be quite important, right? How is it that nationalism is expressed? The how of how nationalism is expressed would seem to be quite important. Again, I'm not familiar with that book, so I can't speak to it. Although certainly the question of nation is quite important, even in a place like Lebanon, where the national is so fraught and there are so many different people making claims to the nation.
Great, thank you. I did have a quick question because I am really super focused on political economy. Can you talk about maybe, I know that I think you mentioned financialization and sort of speculative investment in media infrastructures in Beirut, but maybe talk about the actors that are involved in that and how it's different, you know, for Hizbullah versus maybe other media actors and how that manifests itself.
Yeah, so I'm interested in political economy, not just political economy of the media, but political economy of urban space in particular. And a big part of what the book wants to do is to show these things as being bound up with each other, not separate spheres totally unconnected, but in a place like Lebanon, a sectarian group belonging becomes the basis for political representation, which turns into specific political parties trying to equate themselves with a particular religious group or ethno-sectarian group, which turns into patterns of clientelism and patronage. It turns into control over broadcast spectrum. It turns into who gets to control post-war construction over which part of the city, for example. So Solidaire, closely aligned to Rafiq Hariri, Sunni businessman from Saida, who's given a bunch of money in Saudi Arabia to come be like a certain kind of emissary to Lebanon, which he then translates into a terrestrial and satellite TV channel. So I try to attend quite closely to these things. That chapter 2 about post-war construction, you're picking up on something much more specific though, which is I make an argument for the importance of considering visual forms to the process of financialization. That images of before after in their original incarnation were not primarily about persuading publics, but had a utility in financial boardrooms, lent credibility to and embodied the process which Solidaire was promising to deliver on. Like, it's not an intuitive thing that what global investors will want to do is put money into post-war construction. That's not obvious, right? Why, if you're going to put the 1990s have all kinds of places for new global funds to travel to and new circuitries along which they move, why specifically should they go into post-war construction? Well, images are part of that story. The translation of the space into a series of data points in GIS systems and company ledgers, which are then outputted to a different space. Images become crucial to that process. And a visual relationship to the city is primarily what post-war construction promises. The city's surfaces will look clean and polished. We'll remove those bullet marks. Will's right when he says there's a papering over of the Civil War. There is an attempt to render the space as though it had never been touched by war for large parts of it.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all our guests. And then folks in the chat is our links to our upcoming events, how to sign up for those. And I think maybe also a link to Hatim's, to purchase Hatim's book. So thanks everybody so much for participating, and see you guys next time.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.